Greetings and salutations, and thanks for checking out the video. We're going to talk about inner groove distortion today, and we're going to talk about some of the other types of distortion you may be hearing from your records and give you some reasons why it might not be your equipment causing the problem. Before we get into that subject, though, I would like to just say a couple of words to some folks who have been leaving comments on my videos that have not been very nice. If you don't like the way I present my videos, you are more than welcome to click something else. I will take my time and I will explain what I am talking about in as much detail as I feel is necessary. I do not feel it necessary to be brief or get to the point. Most of the people who watch my videos enjoy talking about this subject and don't mind if I rattle on for a bit about it. And if I choose to put a small personal update at the beginning of the video for folks who have been watching my videos for a long time about what's going on in my life before I get into what I'm talking about, deal with it. Okay? Thank you. I feel better now. Before we can describe some of the complex reasons why you hear inner groove distortion on your records and sibilance and a few other things, we need to define exactly what is going on and why we call it inner groove distortion. The disc record system has a flaw in it that is called diameter loss, and it is something that has been known about since the early days of disc recordings going back to the 1890s. And it is because we're dealing with some physical things going on here that are very hard to ignore or get away from. When you have a disc that is spinning at a given RPM, let's say 33 1/3 RPM, and you want to trace it with a stylus, which is exactly what we're doing when we record or play back a record, you're going to have to deal with the fact that the surface under the stylus will be moving faster toward the outer edge of the disc than it will toward the spindle. And that's just simply because in a given time for a revolution, there is more surface area to cover on the outer edge of the disc than there is toward the center. What happens is here, especially in LPs that go at 33 1/3 RPM, is that you have a curious situation where the velocity of the record surface goes down as you move toward the center to the tune of, it starts out at about 20 inches per second at the beginning of your track, and as you move toward the end you're getting down to about 8.5. For those of you who have experience with analog tape recorders, you may understand that, may have a better idea understanding this when you realize that we're dealing with a it would be like making a tape recording that started out at 15 IPS, and as you moved your way through the reel, by the time you got to the end of the reel, the tape was moving at 3 3/4 IPS. And for those of you who have worked with tape, you know that the difference in audio quality between 15 and 3 3/4 can be rather great. So when records are recorded and played back, you need to keep this in mind, that as we move toward the center of the record, the information that is recorded in the groove, the vibrations, will actually be sort of compressed like an accordion. There's more stretched out toward the edge of the record, and as you move toward the center of the record, that information is compressed more, and it makes it harder for your playback stylus to track. And the amount of distortion that you get is directly linked to the level at which you try and record your record. So the maximum level that you can get on the side of a record is determined by what is the maximum level you can get on the last part of the record toward the center of the record, the inner grooves, without causing a great deal of distortion. And if you think about that, it's kind of, you feel like you're kind of putting the cart in front of the horse, you know, but that's what they have to deal with when they're cutting records. And it's all determined by level. That's what I was trying to say there. And of course, we do know that disc mastering engineers just love to try and put a lot of level in something. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Sibilance. What is sibilance? Well, it has to do with level, but it's actually a little bit more complicated. When we talk about measuring the level of recorded audio on a disc, what we're actually talking about, what the determining factor is the velocity of the recording stylus. Now, we're not talking about the surface moving under the record. We're talking about how quickly the recording and playback stylus has to go back and forth to put the information in the groove. So it's a combination. As you try and put more audio on the record, the excursions get bigger, and then we have to have a higher velocity of the playback and recording stylus because it takes longer to go from the outer, the outer edge of the wave to the upper and back and forth. I hope that makes sense. Now, if I'm confusing you in any way, I have in the description to this video put a link to a wonderful article by Gary Gallo who explains in great detail about stylus velocities and how it works with the RIAA curve and different recording characteristics that have been used through the years. I highly encourage you to read it because he does a much better job of explaining it than I will in this video. The real trick to getting high fidelity audio into the grooves of an LP record is to control the velocity of the stylus. All right? Because for certain, as you move from the lower end of the audio spectrum to the upper end, these velocities change dramatically. There's a lot more energy in the lower end of the spectrum than there is in the upper end. And so they have to be regulated, which is why we have the RIAA curve and we have the preemphasis and deemphasis we talk about. For those of you who will not go read the article, I'll very quickly explain this concept of velocity in the groove this way. If we have a 1 kilohertz signal, 1,000 cycles per second, and we're recording that on the surface of a disc, and for right now, we're just going to talk about pure monolateral modulation. We're not going to get into stereo or any of that stuff. We're just trying to record a mono signal on this disc. And we record it at a given level, let's say 5 centimeters per second, which is the 0 VU of disc recording. If we decide that we're going to go ahead and record a 2 kilohertz signal, we'll double the frequency, we're going to do it at the same amplitude, then a strange thing happens. The velocity of the recording and the playback stylus goes up twice. It has to move twice as fast to record the same amplitude. Now, which means that if we said that our 1 kilohertz signal was at 5 centimeters per second, to reproduce a 2 kilohertz signal, we're now up to 10 centimeters per second, or twice what in velocity and power what we recorded to get the same amplitude at 1 kilohertz. A magnetic phono cartridge responds to this velocity. That's what makes the difference between a loud and a soft signal in a magnetic phono cartridge. In the RIAA curve, you get the curve by switching back and forth between what is known as constant amplitude recording and constant velocity recording. In constant velocity recording, using our 1 kilohertz and 2 kilohertz example, if we wanted to record 1 kilohertz at 5 centimeters per second, and then we wanted to record 2 kilohertz after that, but we wanted to keep the same velocity, 5 centimeters per second, we would need to reduce the amplitude of that 2 kilohertz signal by half. In other words, we're dropping down 6 dB per octave. This is what your equalizer does in your preamplifier, is it compensates for this. And in the RIAA curve, which is pretty much standard all around the world now, you have a shift from constant velocity recording at 2 kilohertz, about 2,122 cycles. There is what's known as a turnover frequency, and we switch to constant amplitude recording, which means that the velocity goes up twice for any given amplitude as the frequency is doubled. Now mainly you can get away with this because in natural audio, in ambient audio in the world, the actual strength of high frequency audio is less than low frequency. A lot of the energy that we hear is in the lower frequencies. So as if you looked at it on a real-time analyzer, for instance, as you would look at the higher end audio, it would go down, and as you this is just in the real world. So even though the velocity is going up on our record, as we double the frequency, it's compensated for naturally, or at least it should be. Disc mastering engineers need to look at this too, is that they're understanding that high frequencies become quite an issue when recording discs, and if they are unnaturally boosted in any way, then the velocity of the recorded and played back groove is going to be something that is an issue that the cartridge playing it back and the cutting head is going to have to deal with, because as you can imagine, as velocities go up, tracking it gets harder for the playing stylus, and it works the recording head very hard to move that stylus back and forth at such a high rate of speed. And the G-forces within the groove go way up as well. When you have a record that has high velocity recording in the high frequencies, and you have a cartridge for one reason or another is not compliant enough to be able to track it, if it runs into something, let's say an S or a cymbal with a great deal of velocity that the cartridge is unable to track, it no longer follows the walls of the groove. It starts to rattle around, and it makes that hissing sound that we call sibilance. It is incumbent upon the disc recording engineer to manage the high frequencies so that the average cartridge will be able to play it back. Of course, logically, you would think that that's what they would have to deal with, right? However, we have now switched from the technical reasons why we hear this type of distortion on our records, and we now move into the philosophical problems that go into this system. I'd say 30 or 40 years ago, when the LP was king and its only competition was tape, engineers strove to make a disc that could be played by all kinds of different record players, whether they be really expensive high-end units or the cheaper stuff that was available at department stores. With the ceramic or the low-end magnetic cartridge and the spherical stylus that was tracking anywhere between 2 and 4 grams. They tried to record a record that could be played acceptably on pretty much anything. In other words, it would sound good on the cheaper stuff, but you'd still get the quality on the higher end. So therefore, there's a compromise in level and how much high frequencies you can actually pump into the groove and that sort of thing. It's exactly the same thing that we dealt with in radio broadcasting, where you would be setting up the audio processing equipment, trying to figure out how to get the best sound on both a little table radio and people's big, nice tuners in their big stereo systems. If you would tune the system specifically to sound good on a big tuner, like a big stereo system with a really high-end tuner on it, in other words, you made sure it had lots of dynamics and it was really crisp and all this other stuff, it wouldn't sound so great on the table radio, because the table radio just wasn't able to deal with the dynamics. So there was always a compromise, and as long as you weren't in the middle of a loudness war where you had one radio station that was just trying to be the loudest thing in the market and you were actually competing with them to try and make your signal louder than theirs, you could find a happy medium where it sounds good on pretty much anything. Of course, when we were making these decisions, we had really good radios in radio stations, and I call it the AM stereo effect here, because if you are programming an AM stereo radio station and you are using an air monitor to listen to the audio coming back off the transmitter to make your decisions on how you're setting up the audio processing and equalization, let's say, you're hearing something that people on the street cannot hear. Now, I've used that before as a analogy, and somebody said, this guy's an idiot. He's only worked in AM radio stations, and they sound like crap. Just for the record, not only have I programmed AM radio stations, but I have programmed many high-fidelity FM radio stations, and I have been in charge in satellite feeds for networks as well, where we were sending audio to be on all kinds of different radio stations. No, I call it the AM stereo effect because we had better radios than anybody on the street. I mean, 90% of the folks who were listening didn't even have stereo, and of course, most AM radios are very narrow band, sound like crap, right? So we would have to keep that in mind. Yes, it needs to. We can make it sound great here for us, but why? What is the point in making it sound really good for us and maybe only about 10% of the population that's actually listening? And I think these engineers, especially with modern pressings, now that they have these, the art of recording records didn't stand still over the last 30 years. Back in the 70s and 80s, you were really hot if you had a 500-watt lathe, 500 watts of amplification. Oh, a lot of folks now have 5,000 that they're cutting modern records with. And you get to a situation where you can actually cut a master for a record that nobody can play, that the average stylus can't track. And the only people that possibly could play it are those who are willing to spend hundreds or maybe even thousands of dollars on super high-end phono cartridges. I was doing some research for this video, and one engineer actually said that he would never reduce the high-frequency response on his records to compensate for inferior cartridges, and if a person playing it back did not have a microline or Shibata-shaped stylus, well, that was their problem. How silly can you possibly be? Why would you want to put out a product that 90% of the people who go out and spend their hard-earned money on cannot get the full enjoyment out of? Why would you do that? Not all of us are aware of stylus shape. Lots of folks go out and buy an Audio-Technica LP120 turntable, or even cough up the money for a Thorens or a Project. And these turntables are coming with $100 cartridges with mild elliptical styli on them. So yes, I'm talking directly to you now, disc mastering engineer. Don't you see the folly in that? That you are producing a product that only only about maybe 10 or 15% of the people who actually go and buy it can fully appreciate? Why can't you use your sophisticated metering to make sure that you keep it well within the compliance of, let's say, an Audio-Technica, let's use the AT95E or 91 ECD as an example. Why can't we use that as a level at which we're going to shoot at to try and get perfect reproduction? See, this is another flaw in the disc recording system, in the whole thing, and it's been like this since day one in the world of the phonograph. Other than Thomas Edison himself, who created both the records and the machines, there has never been a standard reproducer. Never. And certain companies tried to standardize the reproducer. Columbia Records produced their own record players when they introduced the LP. They were built by Philco. RCA did the same thing, where they had equipment that was designed to play back their records. And supposedly, the mastering engineers for those record companies were recording with the understanding that it needed to play back properly on even the lower end of the RCA line. Let's say if you were recording an RCA record, then you knew that it would have to play back on your standard orthophonic hi-fi Victrola of the 1950s. Nowadays, we don't have that. RCA no longer makes their own records. Nobody's paying attention to those standards. That fell away back in the 1960s when, companies that were making reproducers like Gerard, Thorens, Techniques, Pioneer, Sansui, all of these different brands that we talk about, they came along and they weren't directly linked to the records themselves. There's also a great deal of literature that talks about how recording lathes for records supposedly were originally calibrated to be able to be played back properly with a 0.6 mil spherical stylus. And that was the standard that, let's say, the early Neumann and Scully lathes were set up to. Nowadays, it's the same problem that we had with CDs with disc mastering engineers. Let's make them louder. And a lot of folks have come to vinyl because they're so sick of all of the signal processing and the compression and the limiting that has destroyed the sound of CDs. And it seems to me that some of that is carrying over to the world of vinyl. Let's see how much audio we can cram into these grooves. It's this constant thing about try and put 10 pounds of crap into a 5-pound bag. Quit. Okay? You're going to drive people away from this medium the way you've driven people away from the CD. Why does everything have to be so loud and so crisp? It's unnatural. It doesn't sound good. You can refer to my video about why CDs sound so bad. I'm still fielding comments on that one. I'm up to about 80 or 90,000 views on it. So people obviously care about this issue. If they didn't, they wouldn't be watching it. Well, the same thing is happening in the world of vinyl, folks. And you've got certain engineers that are pushing the limits and using their $100,000 record lathes to cut records that a $100 cartridge has a hard time tracking. And that's why you're hearing intergroove distortion, and that's why you're hearing sibilance. And yes, it is important to set your turntable up properly, get your tracking forces and everything else the way they should be, but don't be too surprised if you go out and plunk down $25 or $40 for some of these double LP sets and get them home, and they won't play properly. You just have a mastering engineer who's pushed it a little too hard, and he's cut a record that your cartridge can't play. Now, maybe if you go out and spend $200 or $300 and get yourself a nice, let's say, Ortofon 2M Black, which is about $500 or $600, or maybe you'd like to have I even have a problem spending the $150 to $200 for a AT440 MLA with a microline stylus in it. Not because I have anything against microline styluses, mind you. It's because I can't play my styrene 45s with them, because a microline or a Shibata stylus will eat polystyrene and destroy the record. So I don't really want that stylus shape around. I don't have anything against it. If you have all LPs and you want to spend the money, go right ahead. You're going to get some really incredible performance. What I don't like is the attitude of, we're going to actually make a medium that only this certain particular type of reproducer is going to be able to reproduce. That, to me, that's silly. I mean, if you have people going out and spending hard-earned cash on something, when they get it home, they should get acceptable quality, regardless of how much money they spent on the equipment they're playing it on, as long as that equipment meets minimum requirements, which most equipment does, with a magnetic cartridge on it. So there you go. That is my explanation, my rant. I wish you good luck. Happy listening, everyone. Thanks for watching the video. Wave and bye-bye. Talk to you again soon.